Good evening. My name is Scott Lair. I'm the CEO of the Delaware Historical Society, and on behalf of the Society's Board of Trustees, its Center for African American Heritage Advisory Council, and its staff, it is my privilege to welcome you this evening. As I said, we have a full agenda, and we will begin momentarily with a lecture, followed immediately thereafter with an exhibition preview of Forging Faith, Building Freedom, African American Faith Experiences in Delaware, 1800 to 1980. In 1813, 200 years ago, a former slave, Peter Spencer, relying on faith and determination, overcame nearly insurmountable social odds in establishing our nation's very first independent African American denomination, the Union Church of African American Members. And that happened in the very shadow of this building. So we are in a very special place this evening. The exhibition that you will see shortly is inspired by the courage, the tenacity, and the vision of Peter Spencer. It really is a groundbreaking effort as this project introduces new historical objects and new scholarship this evening. There are literally scores of people and organizations to thank and acknowledge for making this a reality. None more so, however, than the project director and the chief curator of the Delaware Historical Society, Dr. Connie Cooper. And at this time, I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Scott, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be at this day, a day that we've been working towards for a long time. So I welcome you to this beautiful event this evening. We've been on a long and interesting journey over the past year as we created this exhibition. It's a journey that has taken us many new places, introduced us to many new people, and allowed us to learn many new stories about a significant part of Delaware's history. Many individuals and churches have entrusted their precious documents, objects, and photographs to this exhibition. The two most important words I have today are thank you. This has truly been a community project involving many churches, organizations, individuals, and other museums and libraries. The acknowledgments panel down in the exhibition gallery has well over 60 names on it. So we don't have time to thank everybody individually, but please, everyone, know that your contributions to this project are greatly appreciated. That being said, there are three groups I would like to single out for special thanks. One is our colleagues on the Collections, Access, Research, and Exhibition team at the Delaware Division of Historical and Cultural Affairs, and Master Carpenter Doug Fagley. They designed, fabricated, and installed this exhibition. So could you all take a quick stand up, please? Or if you want to. Now, this is the first cooperative venture ever between the Delaware Historical Society and Historical and Cultural Affairs, and it has really worked out beautifully. You'll see the beauty in the exhibition downstairs, and also our two teams have worked very well together to actually make this happen. We'd also like to thank the Delaware Humanities Forum, a state agency of the National Endowment for the Humanities, for its financial support of this project. The Forum, an independent agency, promotes understanding and appreciation of the humanities and their relevance to current issues of public concern. And any nonprofit group or organization in Delaware can apply for a grant. Finally, I'd like to thank the staff of the Delaware Historical Society, my friends and colleagues, stand-up friends, who have contributed so much to this project. Everybody's shy today, okay. But thank you so much. Now, as I worked on this exhibition over the past year, I quickly came to realize that what we are doing here is an introductory exploration of the topic. It's the alpha, not the omega. And we hope that Forging Faith, Building Freedom stimulates further collecting, research, and discussion. We are offering a way to take a next step on Saturday, October 5th, with a research on caring for your collections, whether it's a church collection or any other sort of collection. Because if we do not preserve and collect and take care of our historical materials, we'll be losing our history on any and every topic. So we've got flyers for the workshop available in various places this evening, and you're welcome to sign up right here now today at the gift shop. Another step that some of you might want to take is coming this Saturday. There's going to be a meeting here at 10:30 of the Delaware chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society. So that's another possibility, too, for further research and growth in African-American history. On your chair also is an evaluation form for this evening's lecture and exhibition opening. Please take a few minutes to fill it out and leave it in the box in the gift shop as you leave. Your responses are important to us, and if you don't have a pen or pencil, that's not an excuse. We do have pencils available on the table in the back of the room. So we would appreciate your taking a few minutes to fill that out. And now I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce and thank our speaker for this evening. Dr. Lewis V. Baldwin has been with this project almost from the beginning as our consultant historian and a core member of the curatorial team. But his contributions to this project go way above and beyond the title of consultant. He is a true friend to this project, and his knowledge, enthusiasm, and support have been a great help to me. I'm saying more, so you can sit down. It's just the first paragraph of the introduction. I got to tell people who you are, Lewis. Dr. Baldwin's life journey and academic career uniquely qualify him as a scholar of the Black church. He grew up in southern Alabama during the Civil Rights era. He's a son of a preacher, and he's a Baptist minister himself. So the Black church is part of who he is, and not just his field of study. His educational journey took him from a BA in history at Talladega College to master's degrees in Black church studies and theology from Crozier Seminary, and finally to a PhD in American Christianity from Northwestern University. Since 1983, he has taught at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, where he is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies. Dr. Baldwin's first major research interest was Peter Spencer in the African Union Methodist tradition, which of course gives him the ideal combination of studying both the Black church and the Black church in Delaware, which is what we need. That led him to his first two books, Invisible Strands in African Methodism, published in 1983, and The Mark of a Man, Peter Spencer in the African Union Methodist Tradition in 1987, both of which are now out of print. Since then, his scholarship has been primarily on Martin Luther King Jr., and he's published widely on King's thought, spirituality, and culture. Some of his recent titles on Dr. King include Never to Leave Us Alone, The Prayer Life of Martin Luther King Jr. from 2010, The Voice of Conscience, The Church in the Mind of Martin Luther King Jr., and In a Single Garment of Destiny, A Global Vision of Justice from 2013, this year. So let's welcome Dr. Baldwin, who will speak to us on Forging Faith, Building Freedom, Black Churches in the Circle of Culture in Delaware.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I didn't expect such a long introduction. Vernon Johns at Dexter Avenue Church in Montgomery had an interesting thing to say about introductions. He said, those who deserve it don't need it, and those who need it don't deserve it. I'd like to think I deserve it, but don't need it. First, I want to express my deepest appreciation and gratitude to Scott, Connie, and other staff persons here at the Delaware Historical Society for the privilege of serving as the consultant historian for this exhibition, and also for the invitation to give the keynote lecture at the opening of this program, which will be followed by an exhibition preview and reception. It's clear that a lot of thoughtfulness and creativity have gone into this exhibit. Connie, of course, with the assistance of her staff, has worked so hard collecting and editing materials, adding materials, and including captions for all of the graphics and the actual items on display. And we can't not overlook the impressive work of Edward McWilliams, the designer, and the churches and church leaders that have made their own generous contributions to this exhibition. I say thanks for your support and your presence here this evening. I hope you will check out this exhibit and that you will tell your friends and relatives, co-workers, fellow church members, and anyone else you might know or see about not only the main exhibit here at the Delaware Historical Museum, but also about the online version of the exhibit, which is coming in November and which will feature materials and/or highlights from the main exhibit along with some additional material. The topic of my lecture this evening is Forging Faith, Building Freedom, Black Churches and the Circle of Culture in Delaware. As I was preparing this lecture, I benefited from conversations with Connie here at the Historical Society, Dr. James Newton, who may or may not be here tonight, and my former classmate, the Reverend Dr. H. Ward Greer, who has pastored a number of United Methodist churches in the Wilmington area. There are 3 points that I want to establish and highlight briefly before getting into the heart of my presentation, and hopefully what I have to say will reinforce and build on these 3 very important points. First, we need to bear in mind that Delaware and Delawareans figured prominently in the rise and development of African American religion and of independent black churches in the United States. In other words, one cannot talk about black faith and black church history in this country apart from a serious consideration of Delaware and Delawareans. Unfortunately, this point has not been taken seriously by historians. The story of black religion and black churches in Delaware is crucial, I believe, to not only Delaware history and regional history and black history, but also to the larger fields of American history, and yes, even world history. My second point is this. We know that this project on black faith communities was planned largely as a part of the bicentennial celebration of Peter Spencer, African Union Methodism, and the August Quarterly. And a special part of the exhibit focuses on this. But we want to make it clear that African American religion and black church history in Delaware are not about one great leader or a particular church tradition. We have to think in terms of the multiform character of black faith and black churches, which means that we have to give serious consideration to the United Methodists, AMEs, Baptists, and other churches and church traditions that have played such a major role in Delaware history. And we also have to take into account those traditions that are not Christian, such as the Nation of Islam or the Black Muslim movement. And of course, I think the exhibit reflects this broader and more inclusive view of African American faith communities in this particular state. And now my third point, you will notice that the exhibit highlights 4 figures who were Delawareans and who made significant contributions to black church origins and developments in Delaware and in other parts of the mid-Atlantic region in the early 1800s. Peter Spencer, the father of African Union Methodism; Richard Allen, founder of the AME Church; Absalom Jones, who organized the first African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia; and Samuel Cornish, who founded the first Presbyterian church in this country in New York. These 4 figures were pioneers. They were among the original black church founders. But I will be mentioning the names of numerous other figures, male and female, who loom large in the history of black religion and black churches in Delaware. I'm using a chronological pattern tonight with a focus on several major time frames as I trace the spiritual significance of black religious communities and their impact on the social, educational, and political culture of Delaware. The first historical period extends from 1639, when the first African slaves reached Delaware territory, up to 1787, when the U.S. Constitution was completed and unanimously ratified in Delaware with its principle of voluntarism or its principle of religious freedom. And I refer to this broad historical period under the title African Origins, Early Missionary Activity, and the Rise of Biracial Religious Life in Delaware, 1639 to 1787. In most cases, there are 2 points that I think I should make about this first time frame. In most cases, the spiritual welfare of blacks, who constituted slightly more than 10% of the total population in Delaware by 1787, their spiritual welfare was neglected because many whites felt at that time that if blacks were converted to Christianity and exposed to the Bible, they would possibly learn about the Exodus story, about Jesus' message of freedom and liberty to the captives, and would thus become uncontrollable, perhaps even rebellious against slavery and the whole system of white domination. Those Africans who were not Christianized obviously continued to hold on to African religious beliefs and to secretly engage in some version of tribal religious practices that had come from Africa. This conclusion, of course, is supported by the research of so many scholars, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Melville J. Herskovits, Leon Litwack, and Albert Rabbitoe. The second thing that happened in this period, 1639-1787, is that those Africans who did convert to Christianity routinely worshiped with their owners in white churches. We don't often think about it, but in the century leading up to the American Revolution, it was quite common for blacks and whites to worship together in the same churches, and that was true of the North and South, and most certainly true of Delaware. Now, this is not meant to suggest, however, that the churches here in Delaware in that period were racially integrated in the truest sense. That was not the case. Blacks enjoyed no real freedom or equality of ecclesiastical status with whites in these biracial churches. They simply worshiped together in the same congregations because the whites felt the need to keep an eye on blacks. And of course, the status quo demanded that blacks be kept under surveillance and control. We must remember that 4 black Delawareans and church founders featured in the exhibit here, Spencer, Allen, Jones, and Cornish, came out of white churches and had been exposed to a biracial religious life before seeking religious freedom and ecclesiastical independence. The first organized efforts among slaves to bring the Christian gospel to slaves came from the Anglican Church in Delaware, under the auspices of what was called the Society for the Propagation in Foreign Parts. Now, the SPG was founded in 1701, and it was designed to missionize not only white colonists, but also Indians and blacks. But blacks did not respond well to the Church of England, primarily because it had this elitist style, and it had the practice of reciting creeds and articles of religion. And blacks had come out of cultures in Africa where they danced their religions, and certainly the elitist style of the Church of England did not appeal to them. A second major organized effort in Delaware to reach blacks came with the First Great Awakening, which was the first major wave of revivalism in the United States. And the First Great Awakening covered that period from the 1730s up to the early 1770s. And during that period, of course, you had a number of preachers who came to Delaware. You had George Whitefield, the great revivalist. You had the great black preacher, Black Harry Hoosier. You had Jarena Lee. And these people preached to crowds of blacks and whites who met in the open fields of Lewis, Newcastle, Wilmington, and White Clay Creek here in Delaware, because there were no buildings large enough to accommodate the crowds that met for those revivals. And interestingly enough, blacks in Delaware and in other parts of the mid-Atlantic region joined Methodist churches in large numbers. They found the emotional style of the revivals in the First Great Awakening quite amenable, quite appealing. The crying out, the emphasis on the conversion experience. And of course, the First Great Awakening allowed Africans the opportunity to do what? To shout, to engage in ecstatic religion, certain forms of religious expressiveness. And blacks, of course, gravitated toward the Methodist churches in Delaware because of that. Also, Methodist churches took an early stand against slavery. That stand didn't last very long, but they took a stand, and blacks, of course, could also preach in the Methodist churches, in the Catholic churches in Delaware, and in the Presbyterian churches, in the Lutheran churches in parts of this country. One had to have education. But in the Methodist church, all you had to have, of course, was a converted heart and a gifted tongue. And if you had that, of course, you were accepted and could become a preacher in the Methodist church. Now, let me make one other point about this and then move on. You have to keep in mind the egalitarian spirit of those early revivals in the 1730s up to the 1770s. It was believed that although blacks had a different earthly status, they were slaves, they were different in terms of class, but when it came to salvation and when it came to the spiritual welfare of people, it was believed that blacks and whites were equal. So they were equal in terms of spiritual welfare, but in terms of their earthly status and their social status, more specifically, they were not equal. So you have this biracial religious climate dominating with blacks and whites in Delaware in the period from 1639 up to 1787. Now we get to a second period, of course, second major period in the history of blacks in Delaware. And we're talking here about the independent black church crusade and the transformation of religious life in Delaware, 1787 to 1860. Now, during this particular period, you get the development and the crystallizing, or the crystallization, if you will, of segregated patterns in white churches. By the end of the American Revolution, white churches had become segregated. And blacks, of course, were turned off by the segregated patterns, and they began to break off from the white churches in Delaware to start their own churches. One scholar has called this the most stunning transformation of religious life in Delaware in the early Republic period. Now, Peter Spencer, Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, Samuel Eli Cornish, all of whom had come out of white churches, decided that they would develop and spearhead an independent black church movement. Okay? And that movement, of course, started with Spencer and Allen and Cornish and Jones. We know that in 1816, Richard Allen officialized the AME Church in Philadelphia. Jones founded the first African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia, 1794, and Cornish, of course, organized the Presbyterian Church. But Peter Spencer was the only one of these four Delawareans to make a major mark on black church history here in Delaware. Allen, Jones, and Cornish preached here in Delaware at different times, but they never approached the kind of church organizational activity for which Spencer was known in this state. Spencer actually led in the founding of the first two black churches in this state, here in Wilmington. In 1805, he and William Anderson broke with the predominantly white Asbury Episcopal Church, Methodist Episcopal Church, and they went out and started Ezion African Methodist Episcopal Church under the jurisdiction of the predominantly white Methodist Episcopal Conference. And when Spencer found that he and his followers could not function freely in this kind of ecclesiastical arrangement because of white encroachment and control, they left Ezion in 1812 and founded the Union Church of Africans in 1813, which was the first independent black church to achieve denominational status in this country. Like Richard Allen in Philadelphia, Spencer and his folk had to go to court to secure control over their properties and finances, and they ultimately succeeded. This happened, of course, in 1812, 1813, some 3 years before the AME Church was formed as a denomination under Richard Allen. So we are actually talking here about a watershed moment which fundamentally changed not only the course of black religion and culture in Delaware, but black religion and culture in this country. Because up to that point, 1813, the pattern had consisted of integrated participation of blacks in the life of white churches, or what some scholars call biracial patterns of religious life in Delaware. So, in 1813, Spencer gets this independent movement started. And interestingly enough, blacks at that time were inspired not only by the principle of religious freedom in the Constitution, they were inspired by the Word of God as they understood it in Scripture. Some black church leaders back at that time, like the AME preacher Daniel Coker, equated this independent black church movement with the biblical account of the Jews being freed from Babylonian captivity. Others spoke of this movement in terms of a new exodus of God's people from bondage, drawing also on Scripture. I believe that this is the way that Spencer, Allen, Jones, and Cornish felt. They were inspired by the policies of white prescription in the life of the church, but they were also motivated by a desire for autonomy, a desire to be self-governing. And they took advantage of the new constitutional principle of voluntarism in the U.S. Constitution to challenge and eliminate white control of their religious lives and institutions. Wilmington, Delaware was the epicenter of this black church crusade, a crusade not only to worship God in accordance with the dictates of conscience, but to have the freedom to elect their own church officers, to ordain and appoint their own preachers, to discipline their own members, to preach and administer the sacraments in their own way. This was the beginning of black religious freedom in this period. And of course, you get the rise of the black preacher as a kind of multifaceted personality. Some of you have read W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, and you know that in that period from say roughly 1787 up to 1860, you get the rise of the black preacher. Preachers who were not only pastors of churches, but like Spencer, they were common laborers. They were farmers. They were like Paul. Paul was not only a preacher, he was a tent maker. And black preachers understood that their functions extended beyond spiritual leadership in the black community. Now, when the black church movement started, it grew rapidly after the American Revolution. And this happened primarily because the free black population in Delaware increased. In the 1790s, when Peter Spencer arrived in Wilmington, the state of Delaware was 15% African, and only 30% of those were free. According to the census data, by 1820, 78% of Delaware's blacks were free, and by 1840, the number of free Africans reached 87%. So as slavery declined in the state of Delaware and the number of free blacks increased, this created opportunities for the rise of more separate and independent black churches and denominations. But we must remember now that even as these churches emerged, there were many blacks who decided to remain with white churches. A small minority of them, most decided to go out and start their own churches. So when you look at that period, 1787 to 1860, you find the AME Church establishing in roots here in Wilmington with the founding of New Bethel in 1846, Bethel AME Church. You find the African Wesleyan Church, founded in 1837. First Colored Methodist Protestant churches, founded after 1850. And of course, there's a split in the African Union Church 8 years after Spencer's death. And out of that split, you get both the AUMP and the UAME churches. Okay, so you have in this period not only the rise of new churches, but black churches developing out of splits within black churches. And you have all kinds of reorganizations going on and the rise of new churches. Okay? Now, I think we have to understand that those black founders like Spencer and Cornish and others were very brave because they took a lot of chances. They were progressive-minded, they were courageous, they were dedicated. And I say this because there were laws in Delaware at that time which prevented the meeting of a dozen or more blacks at night. There were laws that said that black preachers had to petition a judge or a justice of the peace before speaking before any assembly. And there were laws that prevented black political assemblies. There were so many other laws. So they were quite brave. Now we get to the question of how these churches functioned in black culture at that time, 1787 to 1860. I would argue that these independent black churches, for the most part, took on prophetic and socially active roles. They protested against slavery. They were stations on the Underground Railroad. They took a stand against colonization. Colonization was designed by liberal whites to ship free blacks out of the country while keeping slaves here. And Peter Spencer and Abraham Shadd and other leaders held a meeting in 1831 at the African Union Church where they resisted that kind of policy and said essentially that free blacks were the only voice of advocacy that slaves had in this country. So why ship them out while maintaining slaves here? So you had a number of black churches holding anti-slavery meetings in that period. Anti-slavery meetings held at Mother AUMP Church, at Star Hill AME Church in Kent County. A number of Methodist churches, black Methodist churches, holding these meetings. And they were also involved in the Underground Railroad, that is, providing a safe haven, a sanctuary for slaves who escaped from the South into Philadelphia. And interestingly enough, the August Quarterly Festival, and I like to think of these churches in that period as constituting what I would call a comprehensive community. That is, that they were concerned not only about political liberation, but they became educational centers, because there was no public education for blacks in that period. So the churches became centers of education. They became political forums. Blacks could fulfill their political ambitions and aspirations through the church by becoming bishops and deacons and district superintendents. Because you couldn't be president, you couldn't be court justices, but those political aspirations could find expression in the church. And of course, you have to keep in mind also that the churches became economic centers, educating people in wise economy practices, teaching them how to buy land and own their own homes and churches. So these churches were comprehensive communities in Spencer's time. And I think that the big quarterly festival here in Wilmington embodied and actually epitomized this concept of the black church as comprehensive community. Because the August Quarterly, and I'm sure all of you know about August Quarterly, which was founded in 1813 in connection with the African Union Church by Peter Spencer. August Quarterly afforded opportunities for large numbers of blacks from different churches and denominations to meet here in Wilmington on the last weekend in August to address the needs that were social, cultural, educational, political, economic, and yes, recreational. This festival brought black churches together in a spirit of ecumenism and genuine interchurch fraternity to benefit black Delawareans and blacks from other parts of the Mid-Atlantic region in profound ways. Now, I'm skipping some of what I have because I'll be talking for 2 hours, and I know you don't want that. Now we move to the third period, that I think is important in the history of black churches in Delaware, or faith communities in Delaware, and that's the period from 1860 to 1900. And I refer to this period as, quote, the period of the Civil War Reconstruction and the shifting mission priorities of black churches, 1860 to 1900. During this particular period, black churches had to confront the realities of the instability of black life because the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation brought a lot of instability and disorder in the black community. Slaves had a job. But once slavery ended, once the Civil War ended, they were set free, and they were penniless. There were 4 million of them. They were penniless, they were illiterate, they were homeless, and they faced a very uncertain future. So in the midst of that kind of catastrophic social crisis and the economic and political challenges, black churches had to expand their mission priorities. Okay? They had to go into the South, and interestingly enough, part of that history involves black churches leaving Philadelphia, AME churches, AME Zion churches, Baptist churches, parts of the Mid-Atlantic, going into the South, assisting with the uplift and empowerment of newly freed slaves. Schools were started. AMEs were very much involved in the development of schools, secondary schools, colleges, Bible schools in the late 19th century. Okay? You had Shiloh Baptist Church, which was started in 1874-75 here in Wilmington, also involved in this movement to uplift freedmen, some of whom had been slaves here in Delaware. So you had the rise of a number of new black churches here in Delaware in the late 19th century, expanding this image of the church as all-comprehending institutions, educating people, providing not only practical education, training people how to be farmers, how to be factory workers, etc., but there was a stress on moral and spiritual education, right? And a stress on the basics in terms of writing, reading, and arithmetic. And this was particularly important for people who wanted to own their own homes and people who wanted to take care of their own business matters. So the late 19th century, in this period, you get the rise of new black churches, the reorganization of some churches, and the expansion of this image of the black church as all-comprehending institution. And much of this resulted from the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitutions, because the 13th Amendment freed slaves throughout this country, including here in Delaware. And the 14th Amendment gave them citizenship, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. So with these new political changes, how are blacks trained to confront these realities? They are trained through the church, how to vote. Okay, the church became a proving ground for black political leadership. The churches also, as E. Franklin Frazier say, extended their roles as economic centers because blacks now are free, and they actually had to learn how to build an economic base for themselves. That's a very, very important period in the life of the church. Fourth period I want to deal with, and I'm moving quickly here through this lecture, covered the period from 1900 to 1955. And I call this period the de-radicalization of Delaware's black churches and the increasing diversification of black religion. What am I saying here now? I'm saying that in the early 20th century, 1900 to 1955, Delaware's black churches emerged from virtually every denomination. It was during that period that Methodism no longer dominates in Delaware, black Methodism. You get Baptist churches, you get Kojic, Churches of God in Christ, you get Episcopal churches, and all of these churches emerged to what? To diversify the black religious experience and black religious life. But with that increasing diversification came de-radicalization. Black churches succumbed or capitulated to the rising biblical fundamentalism in the early part of the 20th century. And that biblical fundamentalism taught that you don't get involved in social and political and economic causes. You get people converted. You get them ready for heaven. Okay? That is, if you want to transform laws and institutions in society, you do it by converting people. Okay, but we know that Peter Spencer and others didn't have that view. They went against converting people, but they said that you have to also, what? Work to transform laws and institutions in society. You have to work on both. You not only transform the individual, but you transform institutions. So in the early years of the 20th century, de-radicalization meant that black churches in Delaware virtually, retreated from the radicality of the kind of agenda that had been put forth by people like Allen and Spencer in that period from 1787 up to 1860. Okay? And interestingly enough, because of the decreasing radicalization of black churches, or the increasing dysfunctionality of black churches in that period, you had the rise of alternative expressions of black religion, which spilled over into Delaware. Black Muslim groups, you had the rise of the Father Divine, Daddy Grace movements. And these movements pulled a lot of people from the black churches because they promised heaven right here on earth. Okay, Daddy Grace and Father Divine and Prophet Jones, all of these leaders were talking about a utopian existence here on earth. And they felt that the black churches in the period from 1900 to 1955 were not responding to the needs of ordinary church people. Now, the fifth period, and I'm almost done, fifth period I'm using as a title, Delaware's Black Churches and the Rebirth of the Struggle for Civil Rights and Black Power, 1955 to 1968. Okay? Now, I use this terminology because I believe that Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights and black power advocates in the 1950s and 60s were simply advancing and building on a tradition of black church activism that began with trailblazing civil and human rights activists like Spencer and Allen, Cornish, and Jones. In the 1950s and 60s, Dr. King and other African American preachers revitalized black churches and made them relevant in a major way once again in the struggle for freedom, equal rights, and social justice. King and his Southern Christian Leadership Conference intersected conservative black preachers and laypersons in the civil rights program. And some of those activists came out of Delaware's black churches. The AUMP Bishop George F. Brown of the AUMP Church here in Wilmington, a journalist, a social and political activist, fought segregation in this city and marched with Dr. King in a number of civil rights campaigns in the South. Other AUMP pastors, such as John H. Woodland, Sherman B. Hawkins, and Edward C. Morton, were also involved in civil rights. And on the UAME side, Bishop David Hackett was heavily involved. In 1963, the Mother AUMP Church, Scott AME Zion Church, and Bethel AME Church here in Wilmington sponsored a campaign that sparked picketing and sit-ins that made this city more open, just, and inclusive. And of course, we cannot forget James L. Morgan of the 8th Street Baptist Church here in Wilmington, who became known for his association and work with Dr. King, and the Reverend Maurice Moyer of the Community Presbyterian Church in Newcastle area, who in 1962 led the NAACP in taking action against the discriminatory treatment of black patients and staff persons at the Delaware State Hospital. And let me also say that the annual August Quarterly Festivals here in Wilmington in the 1950s and 60s provided opportunities to inform people and to organize and get people's support for civil rights causes. Speeches were made, flyers were passed out, and other steps were taken to advance civil rights here in Delaware and in other parts of this country. Big quarterly worship services in the 1960s were prime examples of how black church folk put the old-fashioned religiosity to the service of social action. The people united the prayer circle and the picket line, thus recalling August Quarterly celebrations back in the 19th century, when the celebrants combined the ring shouts and the circle prayer with a powerful advocacy against slavery. Now, let me get to the final period, make a few comments. And I've entitled this period, in the throes of a definitional crisis, Delaware's black faith communities in an age of African American religious diversity, 1968 to the present. We know that Dr. King was assassinated tragically in 1968, and with the assassination of Dr. King, the civil rights movement turned the corner, as Lerone Bennett puts it in his writing. Black faith communities turned away from the mass social protest phase of the civil rights crusade and ceased to be centers of mass meetings and rallying points for demonstrators. Some churches became arenas for voting clinics and proving grounds for black political leadership, while others became preoccupied with praise, personal enrichment themes, and a prosperity gospel. The rise of the mega church phenomenon over the last 2 decades has done much in terms of changing the image of the black church and how we do church, not only here in Delaware, but throughout the country. There are new church models emerging today, such as the decline of the neighborhood church, the rise of the electronic church, the hip-hop church, and the capitulation of many of our most powerful black faith communities to a conservative, right-wing social and political agenda. Delaware's black faith communities, like faith communities across the nation, cannot and have not escaped the impact of these enduring trends, which suggest that we are in the midst of a definitional crisis. I think we're trying to figure out who we are as black churches. There's been a decentering of the black church in the black community. A lot of young people, for the first time, have never been to church, don't understand the church, and have no respect for the church. So I think we're in search of an identity, and we need to develop a clear and a new and clear vision, a new sense of mission and movement to deal with all of the poverty and the homelessness and the violence and human destruction. I have visited the websites of certain black faith communities in Delaware, and I know that there are churches and people of faith here that are really trying to spearhead purposeful Christian witness and activism in this new century. The Interdenominational Ministers Action Council in this city has taken steps to bring people of faith together across denominational and racial lines. And the Black Clergy Coalition is a voice of advocacy for justice, housing, and representation. Shiloh Baptist Church, Bethel, AME Church, and countless churches throughout this city and state sponsor youth ministries, ministries for men and women, and so many other outreach ministries that are designed to improve the quality of life for people. But there's much more that needs to be done if black faith communities here are to truly reclaim the kind of prophetic posture for which Spencer Allen Jones and Cornish were known. These men combine ministries of social service with prophetic advocacy and a tireless protest against structures of racism and economic injustice and violence. They understood that it is not enough to feed the hungry, that one must also protest against the very structures and public policies that make people hungry in the first place. In these times of resurging racism, attacks on voting rights and affirmative action, relentless assaults on black males, and high rates of gun violence and incarceration, you would do well to revisit the history and heritage of Delaware's black church founders and ask yourselves, what does it mean to really be communities of faith in the 21st century? Hopefully this exhibition here at the Delaware Historical Museum will not only remind you of your rich history and heritage, but also inspire you to finish the work that started with your forebears. Thank you.